Find your own way home. Welcome back to Hidden Karma Stories. Before we get into tonight's story, hit that subscribe button and share this with someone who needs to hear that leaving isn't always running away. Sometimes it's the first brave thing you've done in years. Now, let's get into it. I want you to picture standing on a shoulder of cracked highway asphalt in the middle of nowhere, watching the only ride you have disappear into heat shimmer, while the men inside are laughing so hard they can't even roll the window up straight. That was me, 18 months ago. And the part that still keeps me up some nights isn't that it happened. It's that they'd been planning it for the better part of a year, and I'd been sitting at their dinner table the whole time, refilling their drinks. My name is Caroline. This is the story of how my husband and his brothers left me on the side of a highway outside Reno, Nevada, as a joke. And how that joke turned out to be the best thing anyone ever did for me, just not in the way they meant it. But to understand how I ended up standing in gravel and dust with $14 in my pocket, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to understand who I thought Nathan was and who I let myself become to keep him. Part 1, the beginning. I met Nathan Walsh 9 years ago at a 10K charity run in Sacramento, California. I want to be clear that I am not a runner. I have never been a runner. I was there because my coworker Denise begged me to sign up with her so she wouldn't have to do it alone. And I am, apparently, the kind of person who can't say no to a friend in a bind. I was 25 at the time, 2 years into a marketing job I didn't love, living off vending machine coffee, and a vague sense that something better was coming if I just kept showing up. Nathan was running the entire course in his volunteer firefighter gear. Full turnout coat, boots, the helmet, in late September heat that had to be pushing 90 degrees. I found out later he'd lost a bet with his captain about overtime hours, and this was apparently the agreed-upon punishment. He crossed the finish line looking like he'd been dipped in a lake, grinning like an idiot, and we both reached for the same bottle of water at the hydration table. He let me have it. "You look like you need this more than I do," he said, even though he'd just run 6 miles wearing what amounted to a small tent. That was Nathan. At least, that was the Nathan I knew for the first few years. He paid attention in a way that felt almost old-fashioned. He remembered that I took my coffee with oat milk and nothing else. He knew I couldn't focus with any noise in the house when I was on deadline, so he'd tiptoe around like he was sneaking past a sleeping baby, leaving little notes and snacks outside my home office door. When my freelance writing business started picking up steam about a year in, he was the one who suggested I quit the marketing job entirely. "You're better than spreadsheets," he told me. "Go to the thing you actually love." He proposed 11 months after we met, on a bluff above the American River, right as the sky went orange and pink behind the hills. I cried so hard I could barely say yes. We got married the following spring at a small vineyard outside Folsom. 40-some guests. String lights wound through the trees, my mother sobbing audibly through the entire ceremony in a way that embarrassed me at the time, and that I'd give almost anything to go back and laugh about with her now. Nathan's brothers stood up as groomsmen. Patrick was the older one, 34 at the time, a diesel mechanic who smelled permanently of motor oil and had a habit of phrasing every opinion like a dare. "Say something different, I dare you." Brian was the younger brother, 29, perpetually between construction jobs, with a smirk that made you feel like you were always one step behind a joke you hadn't heard the setup to. At the wedding, they were just scenery, friendly enough, forgettable even. I had no idea how much room they would eventually take up in my marriage, or how much of myself I would quietly hand over just to keep the peace between us. The first 2 years were genuinely good. I was building my freelance client list one contract at a time. Nathan was working 24-hour shifts at the fire department, coming home wired and exhausted in equal measure. We had a small rental house in Citrus Heights with a yard barely big enough for a grill and 2 folding chairs, and on weekends we'd sit out there with cheap beer, talking about someday. Kids, eventually. A bigger place. The kind of plain, achievable dreams that felt solid, because we were both still showing up for them. Then Patrick and Brian started coming around more. It happened gradually enough that I didn't clock it as a pattern until much later. A Sunday dinner here, a Saturday afternoon watching the game there, and then suddenly they were at nearly everything. At our first barbecue as a married couple, Patrick announced to the whole patio, loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "Nathan's whipped now, you can tell." Brian laughed and added, "Yeah, she's got him on a leash and everything." Nathan rolled his eyes, slung an arm around my shoulders, told them to cut it out. I laughed along because that's what you do. That's what brothers are like, I told myself. It's just talk. But then I started noticing the smaller things. Our anniversary dinner got pushed back a week because Patrick's truck broke down on a Friday, and somehow towing it took priority over 4 years of marriage. My 29th birthday got steamrolled entirely by a dirt bike trip to Lake Tahoe that Brian talked Nathan into 3 days beforehand. "It's one weekend, babe," Nathan said when I finally brought it up, a full 4 days late, my voice cracking more than I wanted it to. "Family's important, you know that." I nodded, because he was right. Family was important. I just hadn't realized yet that when he said family, he didn't actually mean the family we were supposed to be building together. He meant the one he'd been born into, the one that came with its own gravity, the one I'd somehow married into without ever being told the real terms. Part 2, the cracks. Nathan's phone started living a separate life from the rest of our marriage. It would buzz at dinner, during movies, in the middle of conversations I thought we were actually having. He'd glance down, smirk at whatever Patrick or Brian had sent, and set it face down on the table without a word. When I asked what was funny, he'd wave a hand. "Nothing, just brother stuff, you wouldn't get it." I started overhearing things I wasn't supposed to hear. Nathan in the garage on speakerphone with his brothers, all 3 of them laughing about how I kept the thermostat at exactly 71 degrees, how I'd reorganized his tool chest into labeled bins without asking. I stood frozen in the kitchen doorway more than once, dish towel in hand, listening to the 3 of them turn me into the punchline of a joke I hadn't been invited to hear the rest of. None of it on its own seemed worth a fight. That was the trick of it. I think now each individual thing was small enough to swallow, so I swallowed all of it. I laughed at Patrick's jokes even when they landed somewhere just shy of cruel. I asked Brian how his latest job interview went and meant it, even after the 4th or 5th one that led nowhere. I cooked Nathan's favorite dinners and pretended not to notice that date night had quietly become an evening where he texted his brothers under the table while I talked to myself. I told myself this was just what marriage looked like. Compromise, picking your battles. I told myself I was being too sensitive, too needy, too much, and I believed it mostly because believing it was easier than the alternative. When Nathan's old academy buddy announced his wedding in Lake Havasu, Arizona, I was actually excited. A weekend away. Just the 2 of us, I thought, a real shot at reconnecting the way we used to. Then Nathan added, almost as an afterthought, "I was thinking Pat and Brian could come too. Make it a guy's trip kind of thing. You don't mind, right?" Something in my stomach pulled tight in a way I chose to ignore. "Sure," I said. "Sounds fun." I said sure a lot back then. I said sure and okay, and that's fine so often it started to feel like the only words I had left. We took Nathan's truck instead of my car. "More room for everyone," he said, which made sense on its face and which also meant, though I didn't think it through at the time, that there would be no version of this trip where I could simply decide to leave if something went wrong. The drive out was nearly 6 hours, and for most of it, Patrick and Brian murmured to each other in the back seat, the kind of low conversation that stops the second you glance back and starts again the second you look away. Every time I caught Nathan's eye in the rearview mirror, his knuckles were white on the wheel and his jaw was tight, and he wouldn't hold my gaze for more than a second. "What are you guys talking about back there?" I asked at one point, trying to sound light about it. "Nothing, Caroline," Brian said, with that smirk that never fully went away. "Just brother stuff." Nathan didn't defend me, didn't tell them to knock it off, didn't even look at me. All 3 of them kept checking their phones and trading glances through the mirror like they were following a script I hadn't been handed a copy of. Part 3, the rest stop. We pulled off the highway outside Reno for gas and a bathroom break, at a rest stop that consisted of one cinderblock building, a vending machine that looked like it hadn't been restocked since the previous decade, and a faded sign warning that the next services were 50 miles out. I went inside to splash water on my face, mostly to buy myself 30 seconds away from the tension in that truck cab, and told myself I was imagining things. I was being paranoid. I was manufacturing a problem that didn't exist. When I walked back out into the heat, the truck was already running. All three of them were sitting there, watching me through the windshield, completely still. I walked toward the passenger door, confused but not yet afraid. Nathan rolled down his window. And that's when I saw it, not the smile I'd fallen for 9 years earlier at a water table in Sacramento. Something colder. Something that didn't belong to the man I thought I married. Find your own way home, babe. The engine roared. Gravel sprayed against my shins, and the truck pulled out onto the highway, picking up speed, until it was just a shrinking shape on the horizon and then nothing at all. For the first 10 minutes, I genuinely believed it was a joke that hadn't landed yet, that they'd circle back any second, that Nathan would lean out the window laughing and say gotcha, and this would become one of those stories we told at parties for the wrong reasons. But the highway stayed empty. Heat waves rippled up off the asphalt. My phone showed 0 bars. No matter how many times I held it up like that might somehow summon a signal out of thin desert air. I had about half a bottle of water in my purse and $14 in cash. My sandals, cute, completely impractical, chosen because they matched my dress and not because anyone anticipated a multi-mile walk, were already rubbing blisters into my heels within the first half mile. So I started walking because standing still felt worse. And somewhere around the 2nd mile, the shock that had been holding me together started to burn off, and underneath it was something heavier and angrier, and it kept gathering speed. Every small thing I'd swallowed over the past 2 years came rushing back at once and lined itself up like a row of dominoes finally allowed to fall. The missed anniversary, the forgotten birthday, the garage phone calls. Every time Nathan had waved away how his brothers made me feel and told me I was too sensitive. This hadn't been an accident. This had been built, piece by piece, with intention. A retired couple in an RV finally slowed down near the 3rd mile marker. The woman who rolled down the window had silver hair and kind eyes behind purple cat-eye glasses. Her name, I'd learn within the hour, was Carol. "Honey," she said, "do you need help?" And I just broke. I tried to explain something about my husband, the rest stop being left there, but it came out as something closer to wreckage than language. Carol's husband, Frank, didn't ask a single question. He just handed me a bottle of cold water from the cooler between the seats and told me to drink slowly. When I finally got the whole story out, somewhere between sobs, Carol went very quiet. Then she said the words that cracked something open in my chest that I didn't know was sealed shut. "Honey, that's not a prank, that's abuse." I'd never thought of it that way. Nathan had never raised a hand to me, never screamed. He just diminished me, one small joke and one canceled plan at a time, until I'd shrunk to fit whatever space was left over after his brothers took what they wanted. Abuse felt like too big a word for what had happened to me, and also, somehow, exactly the right one. Frank and Carol were headed to Las Vegas, not back toward Sacramento. They offered to drop me at a Greyhound station there, no questions asked beyond what I wanted to do next. Somewhere on that drive, watching photos of their grandkids on Carol's phone and half listening to ordinary family stories, I made a decision that felt less like a choice and more like the only thing left standing once everything else had been cleared away. I wasn't going home. Not that night. Maybe not ever. Part 4, the decision. It was sitting in that RV that I remembered something I'd buried without meaning to. 3 weeks earlier, I'd been in the kitchen chopping vegetables when I heard Nathan laughing in the garage on speakerphone, really laughing, the kind where you can barely catch your breath. I'd asked what was so funny. "Just guy stuff," he'd said, waving me off. "You wouldn't get it." I'd gone back to dinner and thought nothing more of it. Now I understood. He'd been talking to his brothers. They'd been laughing about something they were planning to do to me weeks before they actually did it, possibly longer. The premeditation of it sat heavier in my stomach than the abandonment itself. This hadn't been a spur-of-the-moment cruelty. It had been discussed, refined, scheduled like an appointment. Frank and Carol dropped me at the Greyhound station in Vegas a little before 7 that evening. Carol tried to press cash into my hand at the curb. I refused, mostly out of pride, though I still had my debit card and figured I could manage. Before she let go of my hand, she said, "Whatever you decide to do next, make sure you're doing it for you, not for him." Inside the station, I stood under the departure board for a long time. A bus back to Sacramento left in 2 hours. I could be home by midnight, walk in the door, demand an explanation. But what would that actually accomplish? He'd already shown me exactly who he was with his own mouth, through his own actions. What explanation could undo that? I thought instead about my college roommate, Priya, who'd moved to Portland, Oregon, years earlier, and who had texted me the previous Christmas saying her door was always open if I was ever in the Pacific Northwest. We hadn't spoken much since. Life gets busy, people drift. But something about that offer had stuck with me, the way kindness sometimes does even when you don't think you'll ever need to use it. I walked up to the counter. "1 ticket to Portland," I said. "One way." The clerk printed it without a flicker of curiosity. $150-some, gone, and a bus leaving in 40 minutes. I turned my phone all the way off before boarding. I wanted Nathan to wonder. I wanted him to feel even a sliver of the helplessness he'd left me standing in. The bus was half empty. I picked a seat near the back, pressed my forehead to the window, and watched the desert blur past in the dark, replaying every excuse I'd accepted over the past 2 years. Somewhere around the Oregon border, something in my chest shifted. Not broke. Shifted, like a weight finally settling into a different position. Part 5, Portland. The bus rolled into Portland a little after 2 in the morning. I hadn't turned my phone back on since Vegas, partly out of fear of what I'd find, and partly because I genuinely didn't care yet. There was a pay phone near the station entrance, one of the last of its kind, and I fed it quarters and dialed Priya's number from memory, praying she hadn't changed it in the years since we'd last really talked. She answered on the 3rd ring, voice thick with sleep. "Caroline, it's 2 in the morning." "I know, I'm sorry. I didn't know who else to call." A pause, and then nothing but immediate motion in her voice. "Where are you?" "The Greyhound station downtown." "Stay there, I'm coming." 20 minutes later, she pulled up in a battered little hatchback, hair in a messy bun, still in scrubs from a shift at the hospital where she worked as a nurse. She took one look at my face and pulled me into a hug that smelled like hand sanitizer and the lavender lotion she'd worn since college. "Get in," she said. "You can tell me everything once we're home." Her apartment was a small 1-bedroom in a part of town close enough to hear rain on the windows most nights. She set me up on the couch with a blanket and a glass of water and sat cross-legged on the floor across from me. "Okay," she said gently. "What happened?" So I told her. All of it, the rest stop, the brothers, the months of small humiliations I'd swallowed without nomming them. She didn't interrupt once. Just listened with the same focus she probably gave patients in triage. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Are you leaving him?" she finally asked, "or just making him sweat for a while?" I didn't even need 3 seconds. "I'm leaving him." She nodded like I'd given the correct answer on an exam. "Good. You can stay here as long as you need." That night I slept 11 hours straight, no nightmares, no waking at 3 in the morning wondering what I'd done wrong. When I woke the next afternoon, Priya had already left for her shift, but there was a note on the coffee table, foods in the fridge. "Stay as long as you need. We'll talk tonight." I made coffee and stood on the tiny balcony, looking out at gray Portland sky, and finally made myself turn my phone back on. The screen lit up with what felt like an avalanche, dozens of missed calls, voicemails, texts, all from Nathan. I sat down and read through them in order, watching his tone shift in real time like a chemical reaction. First confusion mixed with irritation. "The joke's over, you can stop now." Then something sharper. "You're making me look bad in front of my brothers, Caroline, this isn't funny." Then, days in, genuine panic. "Please, I'm scared, just tell me you're okay." Not once, not in a single message, did he apologize for what he'd actually done. Just confusion and embarrassment and irritation that I hadn't played along the way he'd expected. I deleted every message without responding. Then I did something I'd been thinking about since the bus ride. I logged into our shared cloud account, the one Nathan had set up years earlier because it was easier for photos and calendars, the one whose password, our wedding anniversary, because Nathan was nothing if not predictable, I'd never had a reason to use against him before. Within seconds, I had access to everything. His messages, his photos. And there it was almost immediately, a group chat labeled simply the boys going back 11 months. I started scrolling, my stomach tightening with every screen. Patrick had suggested it first, back in the fall. We should drop her out in the middle of nowhere and see how she does without you holding her hand the whole time. Brian's reply came 2 minutes later. Dude, yes. She acts like she's so independent with her little writing thing, but she can't function without you. It'd be hilarious. I waited, breath held, hoping Nathan had shut it down, told them they were being awful, defended me. Instead, honestly might be good for her. Like exposure therapy or something. She does kind of rely on me for everything. They'd spent nearly a year discussing logistics. Which stretch of highway would be remote enough without being genuinely dangerous? What time of day would maximize my discomfort without real risk? Even a backup story in case I somehow made it home before they did. We'll just say we thought she caught a ride with someone. Every detail had been calculated. And it got worse. Scattered through the months of messages were screenshots of texts I'd sent Nathan, ordinary, loving, sometimes vulnerable texts, forwarded straight to his brothers to be picked apart. A message I'd sent in the summer, can't wait to see you tonight, made your favorite dinner, with Patrick's comment underneath. Is she always this needy? A photo of a logo I'd designed for a local client, one I'd been genuinely proud of, with Brian's reply. Does she ever talk about anything besides work and feelings? And Nathan's response, the one that made something in me go cold and stay that way. She's not that bad. But yeah, she can be a lot sometimes. A lot. I'd spent 2 years being told, in 100 small ways, that I was too much, too sensitive, too needy, too emotional, when really I'd just been a normal person who'd had the bad luck of marrying someone who treated vulnerability like a liability. I closed the laptop and sat there for a long time, watching gray light shift over the balcony. I didn't feel heartbroken anymore. I'd cried that out somewhere on Highway 80 and on a Greyhound bus in the dark. What I felt instead was something cleaner, something with an edge to it. Part 6, Building Something. The next morning, Priya left another note with a name and number on it. Linda Forsyth, divorce attorney, helped my friend Becca, she's good. I called before I lost my nerve and somehow had an appointment that same afternoon. Linda's office overlooked the river, all glass and clean lines. She met me in the waiting room herself, a woman in her late 40s with sharp eyes behind tortoiseshell glasses and a handshake that felt like a promise being made. "Tell me everything," she said, once we were seated, legal pad in hand. So I did the rest stop, the months of planning, the group chat. I slid my phone across her desk so she could read the screenshots herself. Her expression didn't change, though her jaw tightened more than once. When she finally looked up, she said 5 words that loosened something tight in my chest. "This is clear-cut abuse, Caroline." Oregon, she explained, is a no-fault divorce state, which meant I didn't need to prove wrongdoing to end the marriage. But this evidence ensured Nathan wouldn't walk away with any advantage in how things were divided. "You're entitled to half of what you built together," she said when I told her I didn't want his money. "That's not greed, that's just what's legally yours." That same week, Priya helped me open my own bank account at a credit union a few blocks from her apartment. For the first time in 6 years, I had a debit card with only my name on it. Then came the harder part, logging into our joint savings, the one Nathan and I had built slowly over the years through both our incomes, and finding just over $38,000 sitting there, money I'd helped earn through years of freelance work while Nathan spent freely on truck parts and weekend trips with his brothers. I transferred half, just over $19,000, into my new account. It wasn't theft. It was survival, and it was mine. I emailed my 3 biggest clients, a regional hotel group, a small tech startup, and a chain of coffee shops, explaining I'd relocated for personal reasons but could keep working remotely. All 3 wrote back within hours, unbothered as long as the work kept showing up on time. My income, at least, was secure. Then I blocked Nathan's number, then Patrick's, then Brian's. They didn't stop, of course, they just started calling from numbers I didn't recognize, friends' phones, work lines. The messages rotated through the same handful of scripts. "I don't understand why you're doing this. You're being irrational. We need to talk like adults." Never an apology, never an acknowledgement, just irritation that I wouldn't come home and let them talk circles around me in person. Weeks later, Priya called me while I was working at a coffee shop near her apartment, her voice tight. "Don't come back yet. Nathan's truck is parked outside the building." My stomach dropped straight through the floor. She handled it herself, texted him from her own phone that he needed to leave or she'd call the police. He left. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding for almost a full minute. Around that same time, I discovered that an old friend from Sacramento, Becca, had been quietly feeding Nathan information about my whereabouts under the guise of just checking in. What neighborhood I might be in, where I might be working. I thought back to every time she'd laughed along with Nathan's jokes at my expense, every time she'd waved off my concerns about my marriage, as every couple goes through rough patches. She'd never really been my friend. She'd been Nathan's audience the whole time. I cut her loose with the same clean precision I'd used on everyone else. Living with Priya, I slowly started remembering pieces of myself I'd misplaced without noticing. I liked true crime documentaries, the kind Nathan used to call depressing garbage, so I'd quietly stopped watching them. Now Priya and I binged entire seasons on her couch, yelling at the screen when investigators missed obvious clues. I preferred my coffee black, no matter what Nathan had insisted for years. I worked best late at night, ideas arriving easier after 10 p.m., something Nathan had always framed as a character flaw rather than just how my brain happened to work. About a month in, I realized one morning that I hadn't thought about Nathan in over 24 hours. Hadn't checked for new numbers calling, hadn't rehearsed an argument in my head. I just lived. It felt like the first full breath I'd taken in longer than I wanted to admit. Part 7. The Filing. 5 months after the rest stop, Linda called me into her office. "We're filing today," she said, sliding a stack of papers across the desk. Seeing my own name typed next to Nathan's in official legal font. Caroline Reyes versus Nathan Walsh. My maiden name already restored, made the whole thing real in a way nothing else had managed to. Nathan doubled down almost immediately. His attorney's response painted me as the unstable one, a wife who'd abandoned her marriage over a family prank that went too far, refusing all attempts at reconciliation while Nathan played the patient, concerned husband. Reading it made me physically ill. "They're trying to rewrite the story through legal paperwork," Linda said, setting the filing down. "But they just handed us everything we need." She'd already had a forensic specialist pull GPS data off Nathan's phone records, his location pinging at the rest stop outside Reno, then moving steadily down the highway toward Lake Havasu with no stops, no detours, checking into the wedding venue hotel that same evening. She paired it with social media, posts his brothers had made that very night, photos of the three of them at the wedding reception, captions like brotherhood over everything, all three of them grinning with drinks in hand, while I was somewhere on a highway shoulder with blistered feet and no signal. "They documented their own cruelty," Linda said, something close to satisfaction in her voice. "They were so sure you'd come home apologetic, they never thought to delete any of it." A few weeks later, my mother called, her voice different from usual. Nathan had shown up at her house. "He said you're having some kind of breakdown," she told me, "that there was a small disagreement and you wouldn't take his calls." I told her the truth, the real version, the months of planning, the GPS data, the photos of him celebrating at a wedding while I walked down a highway in 100-degree heat. The silence on her end of the line stretched long enough that I thought the call had dropped. When she finally spoke again, her voice had cracked open. "Oh, honey, I had no idea. I'm so sorry." Part 8. The Hearing. The hearing landed almost exactly 18 months after that rest stop, on a Tuesday in early spring. I woke at 5 in the morning even though it wasn't scheduled until 10, unable to sleep through the nerves. Priya took the day off and made me eggs I barely touched. Nathan didn't show. "A family emergency," his attorney told the court, a claim that struck me as almost funny given everything. His attorney argued the abandonment narrative one more time, painting a portrait of an unstable, vindictive wife who'd cut off contact over a minor misunderstanding. Linda didn't perform. She just stood and laid it out, piece by piece. The 11 months of planning in the group chat, the GPS data, the social media photos timestamped the same night I'd been standing on a highway shoulder with no way to call for help. The judge, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and a reputation for having heard every excuse there was, read through it all in near silence. Then she looked directly at Nathan's attorney and asked him to explain why his client had driven straight to a wedding and celebrated, instead of confirming his wife was safe. He stumbled through something about poor judgment. Driving to a party and celebrating while your wife is stranded on a highway with no transportation and no way to call for help, the judge said, is not poor judgment, counselor. That is cruelty. She granted the divorce, split our remaining assets evenly, awarded no spousal support to either side, and based on the documented pattern of premeditation and the ongoing contact attempts, issued a 2-year restraining order against Nathan, Patrick, and Brian, prohibiting contact through any means. It was over. I walked out of that courthouse into actual spring sunshine and felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph exactly, just tired, and underneath the tiredness, something lighter. Freedom, maybe, finally allowed to land. Part 9, The Life After. With the divorce settled and a little over $19,000 in my own account, I found a tiny office above a bookstore in Portland, 200 square feet with a window that looked out over a quiet street, rent I could genuinely afford on my own. I hung a small sign on the door, Ray's Creative, my maiden name, the one I'd already started using professionally without quite realizing what it meant. My client list grew slowly and honestly. The hotel group referred me to a restaurant owner needing a rebrand. One of Priya's nursing friends wanted a logo for a side business and told 3 other coworkers about me. Word of mouth, the kind that feels earned instead of lucky. About 8 months in, I hired a design student named Ren, all raw talent and enthusiasm, the way I'd been at 23. Priya and I settled into something that felt, eventually, like family. She worked her rotating hospital shifts. I adjusted my schedule around hers. On the nights she was home, I'd have dinner ready, nothing fancy, usually just pasta or stir-fry, and we'd eat on her balcony, talking about nothing important, the way you can only talk when nobody's walking on eggshells. About a year after the divorce, Priya started dating a respiratory therapist from the hospital named Marcus, who had a terrible sense of humor, and the kind of attentiveness toward her that made something in my chest ache, in a complicated way, because it reminded me, all at once, of what I'd thought I had with Nathan before I understood what it actually was. On my harder days, Priya never tried to fix anything. She'd just sit with me until I was ready to talk, and eventually say something like, "You're allowed to grieve the thing you lost, even knowing leaving was right." She was right. I could be grateful for the freedom and still mourn the dream of what I'd believed we were building. About a year and a half after the divorce, I entered a regional design competition open to independent designers across the Pacific Northwest, themed around transformation. I'd been doing pro bono branding work for a local women's shelter, logo, website, the whole identity, built around imagery of birds breaking free from cages. I submitted it without expecting much. 2 months later, I got an email saying I'd won first place in the nonprofit category out of nearly 60 submissions. Priya insisted on celebrating somewhere with cloth napkins instead of paper ones. "You built this," she said, raising her glass. I thought about where I'd been not 2 years earlier, standing in gravel outside Reno with $14 and a pair of ruined sandals, and then about the studio with my name on the door, the assistant who looked up to me, the clients who trusted me. "Maybe I did," I said. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I let myself feel proud of it without qualifying the feeling. Part 10, The Last Word. A little over 2 years after that rest stop, I was at a beachside cafe on a work trip, laptop open, completely absorbed in a logo revision, when I noticed a couple arguing near the parking lot. The woman was crying, wiping her face with the back of her hand. The man's posture was all wrong, dismissive, irritated, waving away whatever she was saying like it weighed nothing. I felt the old pull to walk over there, to tell her she deserved better. That dismissiveness like that is only ever the beginning. But I stayed in my seat, because somewhere in the last 2 years, I'd finally understood something that had taken me far too long to learn. It had never been my fault. I couldn't have loved Nathan into being a better husband. I couldn't have made his brothers decent. The only thing I'd ever had control over was walking away, and I had. That afternoon, back at my apartment, an email arrived from an address I didn't recognize at first. It was Nathan. He'd spent close to 2 years in therapy, he wrote. He understood now what he'd let his brothers turn him into, and he'd cut contact with both of them entirely once he saw it clearly. He didn't ask me for anything. He just wanted me to know that I'd been right to leave, and that he was sorry for the rest stop, for the group chat, for choosing his brothers over the person he'd promised to build a life with. 2 years earlier, that message might have undone me completely. Reading it now, in my own apartment, in the life I'd built with my own hands, I felt something close to nothing at all. Not anger, not vindication, just quiet. I didn't write back. I closed the email, opened a new file for a client's logo, and got back to work. I never found my way back to Nathan, or to Citrus Heights, or to the version of myself who thought shrinking was the price of being loved. I found my way back to the person I'd been before I started disappearing to fit into someone else's idea of who I should be. And she was, finally, completely, genuinely happy. If this story had you holding your breath, drop a like right now and let us know. What was the exact moment you knew Caroline was never going home? Tell us in the comments below, and subscribe to Hidden Karma Stories so you never miss what's coming next.